Navigation simulations are also possible by essentially linking photos together. This is an easy way of studying how people navigate around a space, capturing how they behave in a controlled environment. And the same techniques can be used to simulate a website or a document to test navigation, messaging, and information retention. So hopefully that gives you an idea of new possibilities in online behavioral research that go far beyond surveys. When you embrace online research, there are huge gains. So in this next section, I'm going to show a number of different case studies from different researchers. I've tried to pick some that I think would be most interesting to you, the audience, today. So this is a study from Jim Grange at Keele University. He was looking at the perceptual deficits in subclinical populations with self-reported depression symptomology. He collected data using the QIDS-SR scale, which is a depression scale, self-reported depression scale, and the flanker task. And what he found was that the evidence for deficits in perceptual representations in depression, and specifically that this narrowing rate happened at a different speed in this subclinical population. But what's possibly most impressive is that he's run 3 studies, I think, and the data collection for all 3 experiments, each with about 200 participants, all subclinical populations, basically took a weekend. And in his words, that's unprecedented. This is a study where Carl Jasmine investigated whether listeners compensate for auditory dimensions that they don't perceive well. So his participants were amusics, so people who don't perceive pitch well, and some controls as well, obviously. And then the task was an auditory categorization task that measured the extent to which people rely on these 2 dimensions, pitch and duration, when perceiving speech. And the responses was a 2-way forced choice task with buttons. And what he found was that, yes, amusics aren't able to process that pitch dimension very well, but they compensate using other cues, in this case duration. But Carl Jasmine's main takeaway was this ability to test remotely is critical because it allows him to reach these special populations that live far away. And I imagine that could be similar for those of you looking at psychiatric disorders, because it's hard to get people into the lab. But if you can reach those populations wherever they are, you can reach a larger sample size. This is a study from Valerie Vune at Cambridge University. She was testing the effects of an at-home smartphone-based cognitive bias modification training in heavy drinkers. They tested 161 heavy drinkers using an app, and they all did this approach avoidance training. So when you clicked on the stimulus, if you were to avoid it, it would shrink away from you, and if it was something that you wanted to encourage people to go towards, it would grow towards them. That's what this image is showing. The experiment 1 served as a first proof of concept for efficacy of this new smartphone-based training, approach avoidance training, and experiment 2 suggested that training effects on both craving and problem alcohol use hold at 1 week follow-up. So these are nice early steps. This study is from Kathy Price over at UCL. She runs a lab that's explaining language outcomes and recovery after stroke. This is a slightly different type of study. She's got access to this data set where people have been tested on the comprehensive aphasia test. She was looking at the data, she's got data from over 700 patients with language difficulties after stroke. And she was looking at the data and it didn't make sense. So online research isn't usually her thing. She's usually looking at these large data sets that she's got access to elsewhere, but the data didn't make sense. And she thought, what's going wrong here? So she got out the original paper about the comprehensive aphasia test and looked up the norms, and the norms were based on a sample of 29 normal healthy adults, not a very large sample, and it was quite a while ago, so it's a fairly historic sample. She thought maybe there's something wrong with that data set. So she quickly put together the comprehensive aphasia test into Gorilla, put it onto a platform where she could test it, and collected data from 300, a few more than 300 participants in the UK. And she got that data back overnight, reanalyzed the norms, and there were some weird ones. So what had previously, when the item was a sock, if the person had written socks, that had been marked as wrong, or there was something like a saxophone. But if people wrote that was an oboe or clarinet, that was wrong. And she was like, well, maybe this is where the problem is coming from. And indeed, when she'd collected this new data and renormed it, it completely changed what that data set meant. And it suddenly started to make sense again. And she found no evidence of pure anomia when norms from the 300 participants were used rather than the original 29. So for Kathy, the big takeaway is that the ability to collect new norms at scale overnight has brought clarity to a hugely valuable data set. This study here is from Julia Usher-Smith over in the primary care unit at the University of Cambridge. She was looking at cancer risk. And the question was, during an NHS health check, can the presentation of cancer risk information and lifestyle advice change behaviour? So they were testing this both in GP surgeries, but also online. So they had 1,000 participants stratified by age, sex, and cancer risk. And the cancer risk information was presented in these 4 different ways, together with lifestyle advice. And then there was a follow-up 3 months later to see if any of the lifestyle advice had stuck. What they found was that personalized cancer risk information alongside lifestyle advice increases risk accuracy and risk conviction and the intention to change behavior. And it does so without immediately increasing anxiety or worry. So these are really good effects. Which way of displaying the information depended on the person. There were too many individual differences there, and there were some other nice findings too. And then an example from Teresa Marteau's lab over at the Behavioural Health Research Unit as well. They wanted to look at whether they could nudge participants towards more healthy food purchases. Because of course, in the UK, we have a big problem with obesity. And if we can change what people buy, maybe we can change what people eat. So we built this fake online supermarket research platform, which we loaded with over 2,000 foods, 10,000 foods from the Tesco's API. And then they were running sort of lab style experiments, but in this realistic online environment on large samples. So collecting data from 2,000 participants for each study. And they could manipulate all sorts of things: price, labeling, image, adverts, taxes, and more. I think the main takeaway has been that you can nudge people, but you can't nudge all the people all the time. You have to decide what the intervention is. And various studies have been, other research groups are also using this tool. They can nudge people away from salt, away from high calorie foods, away from unsustainable packaging. And I think the main takeaway, which actually comes from Pasquale Rumo, is that online supermarkets could be doing a lot more to support public health if they wanted to. So that gives you a taste of what's possible. I could go on for ages and ages. There are so many publications now citing using Gorilla, and they're all fascinating. But I can't go into all of them. But hopefully that's given you a breadth of some possibilities. I mentioned earlier that I run this conference called the Be Online Conference, which is all about online behavioral research. If you go to this website, beonlineconference.com, then you will find more than 60 talks all about online behavioral research. And you might find something that relates to your area of research or that is useful to you. There are studies on motor studies online, auditory studies online, memory studies, clinical studies, addiction, and more. And so go take a look, find something that's relevant to you. There are two talks that are tremendously helpful about data quality, one by Jenny Rodd and the other one by Rachel Theodore. And I think everybody should watch those studies, because if you're taking research online, they have so much advice on how to get really high quality data. So this really takes me on to my next section, which is about people's worries about taking research on one. With all these benefits and all these possibilities, why do people not take research online? So one worry is around timing quality. Is the timing quality really good enough? And in 2015, this was a question. So as good scientists, we went and did a paper on it. We collected lots of data on different devices, different experiment platforms, different web browsers, and it's all reported in our paper here, which was written by Alex Amwell-Erlin. And it's a fantastic paper. You should have a look at it. But the main takeaway, I don't have time to go into it in detail. The main takeaway is that, yes, the timing quality is good enough for the vast majority of behavioral research. Another question is about data quality. Is the data quality good? People worry that in the lab they've got control over the participants. They can put them on their own in a room, and they can make sure that they are taking part in the study properly. But if they're taking home at home, they might be distracted. Maybe their data quality will suffer. And actually, that's not what happens. People can get really great data quality online, and I've already mentioned Be Online, but there are lots of talks on data quality there. This was one from, I mentioned Rachel earlier. This is from Rachel Theodore. It's a quote from her that in their latest study, she does auditory research, so really, really boring auditory research where people need to wear headphones. So usually you'd expect attrition to be a bit higher. They only had to exclude 60 out of 120 participants, that's about 5.9%, due to poor data quality. And this included those that failed to meet their a priori inclusion criteria for accuracy, headphone use, and the completed trials. The data quality, once you've honed your protocol, is excellent. If there's one slide that you photograph today or screenshot today, this is the one that it should be. These are the two talks I recommend from Jenny Rodd and Rachel Theodore: ensuring data quality when you can't see your participants and ensuring great data quality online. They're both about 10-15 minutes long. It's not a big ask, but it's such useful content. And then just to give you a sense, here's some data from Casey Rourke at the University of Pittsburgh. She's presented here her in-person data and her online data, and you can see they're very similar. And I quite also like her comparison chart that she presents. In person, they collected data from 30 participants, took about a month. They were all a local population in Pittsburgh, and participants ran on the laboratory computers. Whereas with the online replication, they had a participant pool of nearly 100 participants. They collected all that data in less than 48 hours. Just think about the amount of time saved and effort saved and how you could deploy that time if you got is that nearly a month back. They recruited a global population through Prolific, and obviously participants ran on their own computers and headphones. And you can see here the data quality is really good. You're definitely seeing the same overall pattern. Here's another graph on data quality. This is from Josh Bolsters. This was the task that they ran in the lab. This is called a the top one is the lab version, the right one is the gamified version. Under the bonnet, they're exactly the same task, and this is one of these classic n-armed bandits where you choose between slot machines or cards in this case and try and find the one that pays out the most. And here's the data. So this is what the data looked like in the lab. And here's what it looked like online. And so what you see is this classic pattern is that overall it's noisier, but that the averages are very similar, and so are the standard errors, really. So you're getting pretty good data quality. What Josh also went on to say is sort of on the subject of ecological validity is that hope is that performance with this sort of gamified task would be closer to what you'd expect to see in a real world gambling situation than bringing people into the lab to take part in something like this, which doesn't look like a real world gambling situation. And here's some data quality from an eye tracking study. Again, you can see down here the correlations are really good. On horizontal gaze, R is 0.9 and vertical gaze, R is 0.8. But I find these plots the most useful to sort of eyeball. In the lab, you can see this tighter signal around the blue line where there's less noise in the lab. But in the classroom and at home, you can see it's the same overall pattern, but a little bit noisier. Another worry people have when they're taking research online is about ethics and about reviewer too. So the thing to know is that the whole time you're using Gorilla, you're in safe hands. The internet used to be the Wild West, but that's changing. There's more and more legislation around data security, data ownership, and privacy. You don't want to use software that breaks the law. You don't want to use servers that get burnt down. You don't want to use software that hasn't been validated. We've done all that hard and expensive work so that you don't need to. And then you can focus your attention on the science rather than having to worry about the security. And because our platform has been validated with these published timing papers, and we have hundreds of citations of researchers having used Gorilla, you're in good hands there too. Another worry people have is, will it be too hard? I rather love this quote from Priya Silverstein. I was just messing around trying to see if Gorilla could do what we needed for a project, and I ended up creating an entire demo version complete with all the counterbalancing, ready for the real stimuli to be added later. It's so intuitive and clear. As you can imagine, we're spending a lot of time making our tools both more powerful and easy to use the whole time. So every time we realize that there's something a bit clunky, we make it better, we make it easier, we make it more straightforward. And that means that we have got it to a point where it's really intuitive and clear for people to use. And you'll be relieved that you're not going to have to do any of this. It's all in a user interface, which is easier to understand and faster to work with. And we can link you to the built-in documentation. Another thing that people worry about is, well, will I get lost? What happens when I get lost? It's always daunting taking on new software. I do appreciate that. What we do at Gorilla is that we have a really great support documentation and a really great support desk. About 90% of people just refer to the support documentation, which is excellently maintained by this wonderful group of people. They're all psychology graduates. Jade has a postdoc in psychology. Johanna has a PhD in psychology. Claudia has a master's degree in psychology. Megan is doing her master's degree in psychology. And so if you ever did get in touch with Gorilla, you're going to be getting expert advice from somebody who really knows what they're talking about. So for the 10% of people who contact the support desk, about 88% of tickets get a reply within the day, and 64% of tickets are resolved within that working day. And nearly all tickets are resolved within 48 hours. Every week we have office hours, as many of you will do for your students. So you can jump on a call with us, a video call with us, and that's particularly useful for these more conceptual questions, like how should I go about setting up my study? And then we do regular webinars and specialist sessions. Another worry is whether Gorilla will be able to do what you need. And I've shown you this slide before, so I'll run through it quickly. But between surveys, tasks, games, shops, multiplayer, and a code editor, yeah, pretty much it can do what you need. But what if you need something new? That's always a worry, or that can be a worry for people. So we have this really cool system in Gorilla that you can extend Gorilla for your own needs. So you can build your own components and you can expose these settings as UI elements. And when you build your own components, you can change what things look like, the behavior, the response processing, and the randomization. And it's super cool because it's all accessible through the user interface. So let me just show you this video of what that looks like. So we start here in a Gorilla task. You could go to the scripts pane and then we can just we can create a new component. So here we're going to create a component that changes the screen background color. This can actually be done in the tooling natively, but I wanted to demonstrate something easy and visual. So this is the short bit of code that you'd need. There's a bit at the top that takes the inputs. There's a bit in the middle here in the factory, which does the heavy lifting of changing the background. And then there's the bit at the bottom, which determines what this looks like in the user interface. Down here, where it says, my component does something awesome. Now, when we go back to the tools, we can go and add an object over here. We can search for that object that we've just created. That's called the screen background color. Here it is down here. My component does something awesome. And we can add that to the user interface. And then we can change the screen background color. So that's really cool. This is particularly great for research software engineers who are supporting teams who are using Gorilla. The team can use Gorilla and use all the user interface elements. But if there was ever something that Gorilla couldn't do, then one of their research software engineers could just write that tiny bit of code that's necessary, deploy that as into the scripting tools to make it available within the tooling, and then the team are set free again, and it doesn't have to keep on going back onto the research software engineer's desk. And then another worry that people have is, what about open science? We, as part of Gorilla, we have an open, what's called Gorilla Open Materials, an open materials repository, where researchers, when they're publishing their work, they can publish their tasks and experiments and questionnaires. And the community have been wonderfully generous. And so when they're writing papers, at the bottom of your methods section, you can just include a link to your open materials. So anybody reading your paper can click on that link and go, oh, I can see what that protocol is. That's so interesting. And then they can also clone it into their own Gorilla account. It's free to have a Gorilla account. And then they could run a replication really easily. They don't have to get in touch with you and go, oh, could I have a copy of those files that you did for that? Sorry, oh no, that's stuck on somebody's computer. I'll see if I can get it for you. Oh, we don't know where it is. Instead, you publish it to Gorilla Open Materials and we will preserve it for the rest of time, or at least for a long while. The very first study that I published onto Guerrilla Open Materials when did we launch it? About 2018, so 5 years ago, still runs perfectly today. I love this quote from Dr. Vivian Rogers at Swansea. Open materials is so powerful. I cloned 3 tasks and adapted another. So that removed half the work I needed to do. It saved me so much time. The other thing we've been doing recently is looking at some of our metadata. As I said earlier, the scale of online research is now vast, as we saw, getting bigger. We're in this fairly unique position of having metadata about a wide range of research studies run online. And this metadata tells us something about the state of online research, which can help you budget for your next study, whatever platform you choose to use. So let me show you these some key takeaway data. So what do 1 million participants tell us about online research? So let's have a look at completion rates. Completion rates vary by recruitment policy and also researcher role. So if you're putting your study on social media, you'll probably expect completion rates of around 50%, just over 50%, 56%. But if you're using ID-based policies, which is where you've recruited the participants and you've sort of formed a relationship with them, it's much higher, up at 84%. Similarly, looking at researcher roles, you can see that students have very low completion rates, down at 62%, probably in a large part because they're using these simple link recruitment policies. They're not paying for participants. Whereas PhD students who are designing really careful protocols, working really hard to collect their data, they have completion rates more like 76%. Then in terms of sample size, this one takes a little bit of interpreting. Median sample size looks quite low, down at 40. But remember, most people run a pilot study before they run a real study. So you'd expect for every real study there to be one small sample just testing that it works, and maybe multiple small samples. But when we look at 1 million participants, what we see is that despite a low overall average, most participants took part in studies that were medium or large. About 35% of participants took part in medium studies of 100 to 500 participants, and 25% of participants took part in large studies of over 500 participants. And then the last statistic, which I think is really useful to know, is that the medium study length is about 18 minutes. This varies with recruitment policy. When you're putting things online on social media, they tend to be shorter. When you're using ID-based recruitment policies, you can tend to go longer, where you have that relationship with a participant. What we found was that sample sizes decreased as study length increased. So actually, people are triaging the number of trials, probably. So as your study gets longer, you don't need as many participants. But really interestingly, longer studies produce the same proportion of complete participants. So we don't see attrition going up with longer protocols. If you want to download our prepoint, you can go to this link, gorilla.sc, 1 million participants. This would be one that you could photograph or take a screenshot of. And that will give you a nice infographic and access the link for our preprint as well, our paper as well. So that gives you a sense of where we are at the moment with online research methods. Now, before people switch to online research methods, where are they typically coming from? There are 3 places that they typically come from. One from surveys, from the lab, and from writing code. Let's take a look at each one in turn. There are those who are using surveys and who get to a point where they realize that surveys are not designed for behavioral research. They don't collect reaction time data. It's not designed for trial by trial protocols. The trial randomization is limited, and they realize they're frustrated in using the wrong tool for the job, and so switch to doing behavioral research with a behavioral research platform. There are those coming from the lab who are used to testing participants one by one in the lab, and it takes them 6 weeks to 2 months to collect data from 60 participants. They're finding that data collection slow. They're finding supervising participants is time consuming, and they're getting frustrated with administering participant fees. And instead, the experience they want is, instead of data collection in the lab taking months, I launched a study, went to lunch, and came back to 400 participant responses. And that's the sort of benefit you can get by taking your research online. And then there are those whose background is in code. It's either researchers who don't like coding or those who love coding but find that they're spending all their time coding when they actually want to be doing other things. So coding has quite a high barrier to entry. It's quite technically challenging. It's very rewarding when you manage to do it. But it's not nice to feel that your science is limited by technical capability. And most importantly, it doesn't scale well. If you can code well, that's all very well and good. But what we're seeing is a group of PIs now who want to hire people, and they don't want to have to code all of their tasks or wait for their PhD students to learn how to code. That's going to take them 6 months, when instead they could just use a tool. They can collect their data straight away. This quote from Jade Pickering: "I worked myself into the ground debugging code during my PhD, trying to get it to do what I wanted. I never managed to get in all the nice to have elements I wanted. Overall, I wasted my time coding for a good few years instead of spending time with patients." And she was studying patients with Parkinson's disease, and she would have rather spend time collecting, like more closely working with them. When I was invited to give this presentation, I was asked to do a short. So I'd usually end there with like that's our introduction to online behavioral research. But I was asked to also put in a demonstration of what Gorilla is and what it can do. So I'll jump into that section now. So what is Gorilla? It's everything you need to run an online study. So to run an online study, you're going to need your consent form, your demographics questionnaire, your actual tasks, whether they're surveys, tasks, games, multiplayer, shopping simulations. You're going to need your randomization and counterbalancing, hosting and data collection, security and compliance, and open science publishing. And then once you've got the participant experience all packaged up for data collection, you're going to need your participants from somewhere. And then at the end, you're going to download your data and analyze it in your toolchain of choice. And so that's what Gorilla does, all that bit in the middle. You still need to get your participants from somewhere, and you still need to download your data and analyze it. In terms of how that works, we have this like amazing component system under the bonnet. So there are a limited number of stimuli that you can perceive on a computer. So text, images, audio, video, animations. There are a limited number of responses that you can give through the mouse, through the keyboard, through a touchpad or a touch device like a phone or an iPad. Through the webcam, either gestures, which have been used for sign language research, or through the microphone for auditory speech research, dragging and dropping things, drawing things, as we've seen in the videos. And then there's a limited amount of feedback that can be given in terms of accuracy, speed, and progress. So the way we like to think about it is we give you the Lego building blocks, and you can create whatever you want to imagine. And some people go and create a little car, and other people create the whole Hogwarts universe. It's quite extraordinary, the protocols that people come up with. Under the bonnet, this is what it looks like. I always find it useful just to see what it looks like under the bonnet. And we've leveraged two visual languages that you'll be familiar with. There's the bit where you author what the participant sees, which feels similar to PowerPoint. So we have screens, which are sort of equivalent to slides, and then you put the components onto the page so that you know exactly where they're sitting. And then in order to change the trial by trial content, we have a spreadsheet here so that we can show, for instance, that this is puzzle number 10, it's here, this is trial number 2. That's being fed into this zone here, which is coming from the spreadsheet column puzzle. There's the column puzzle. And here it is displayed over here. So you would upload your stimuli, you list them out in a spreadsheet, you pass them through to the display that the participant sees. So let's have a look at that in action. So with this spreadsheet, all the participants will see the instructions, then they'll see these 7 trials, and then they'll see this finish screen. The first one isn't randomized because I want them all to do an easy trial first, but then these next 6 are in a random order. And then one of the nice things in Gorilla is that we allow you to sort of debug as you go. So you can preview your randomization here and convince yourself that it is set up the way you want it set up. And you can add more complicated randomization rules here. Then you'd have uploaded your stimuli, which are really lovely, and you can search them, you can filter them so you can see that all the stimuli are coming through correctly. And then you go over to your displays where you can see how they're laid out. So this is our instruction screen with an image, a text, and a continue button. And then there's the main trial, which is made up of a fixation cross. And then there you go. And then the second screen will be the main guts of the trial, which is the puzzle and the response images. So there's an image zone, and then 4 response image buttons. Let's see what the trial setup looks like. Sorry, it's glitching. Here you go. So we have what you see is what you get interface. You can drag things around, you can resize them, and this gives you confidence that it is going to look the way you want it to look in front of your participant. Let's say we wanted to add an object, we wanted to add some instructions at the top. We can add a text zone. This is one of our text components. like with PowerPoint, it starts in the middle of the screen. We can change the text, which is the missing piece, and we drag it to the right place. Move it around to the right size, and we can change the text size very easily. You can preview what it looks like on different devices, and you can look at each trial in turn, and you can see how this is again the sort of debug panel where we allow you to see what's going on. It's sort of the equivalent of stepping through in code, so you feel confident. And you can see that Gorilla's processing the correct and incorrect answers, and you can scrutinize the individual rows in your spreadsheet to make sure that it's working as you want. So if you wanted to add something like feedback, how would that work in Gorilla? So the assumption to make is that there is always going to be a component that does the thing that you want. If somebody else has likely wanted this before, there is likely to be a component that does it. So let's say we wanted to add feedback. This is a very common thing. You would go to add object. You would search for a feedback component. It's there in the quick access menu. There's the component. You add it to the page. And the feedback component knows that when the answer is correct, it should show a tick. And when the answer is incorrect, it should show a cross. And one of the settings is that you can change that image. So you could make it a smiley face or a grumpy face if you wanted to, if you're working with kids. Let's say another version is adding a timer. So to add a timer, we need to set two things. First of all, we need to go to the screen and set a timeout on the screen. So we're going to set a time limit. And we can go to set that to 5 seconds. And then we can add the object, which is the display. So we're going to look for the countdown. Here it is. Display the remaining time for the screen in seconds. We add that to the screen. We put that where we want the participant to see it. That component knows to listen to the screen end time, change the text size. And now when we preview that trial, we'll see it count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And you can change how that number is displayed, whether you want it as like a stopwatch instead, if you wanted to. If you wanted to show a progress bar, it'd be the same idea. Go to add a component, find the progress bar, move it to the right location, choose what color you want it to be, and then you'd need to go to the spreadsheet and say which trials should increment the progress bar. Once you've got all of your individual tasks ready, so you might have questionnaires, you might have tasks, you might have games, you need a way to link them together. If you're in something like Qualtrics where it's only a survey, you don't need to link between different types of tasks. But of course, because Gorilla is a mixed methods research platform, you need to be able to link between these different tasks that you've created. And actually, this gift of having the experiment tree makes it really easy to reuse elements and to create novel and interesting protocols. So let's have a look at the experiment tree. Here, all the participants start at the start node, and then here we have a consent form and a demographics form, and then here we have our relational reasoning questionnaire, and then all the participants hit the finish node. What some universities do when they're getting their students to run studies on Gorilla is they create a shared library where they've got the general consent form and the general demographic form that all of the students are going to use. And then they have a library of 10 to 20 tasks that the students can use and make minimal changes to, all of which have been pre-approved with ethics. And you can see how fast that would be. The student just needs to go, I'll take the consent. I'll make the little change I need for my study. I'll take the demographics. Might add just one question, but I don't need to change much. And I can creatively combine these other tasks or scales to answer whatever research question I please. Or you can take a task and then just change the stimuli to use the same method, but with slightly different stimuli. So this modular nature of the experiment tree is really powerful for making it easy to reuse things and get greater efficiencies. So here's a within subject design where now we've got 2 tasks. Where the magic really comes in is with these control nodes. This is an order counterbalance node, and this is our randomizer. So the order counterbalancing node means that in this study, half the participants would get the relational reasoning task and then the affect task, whereas the other half of the participants would get them the other way around. By default, the order node comes with Latin square counterbalancing for all those pairwise contrasts, and you could have 2, 3, 4, 5, however many tasks you want being shuffled. And then the between subject randomizer means that some so this is the randomizer. Some participants will go to this task, whereas the others will go to this task, and you can have it equally weighted, or you could have 1 over here and 50 over here if you wanted to set up a raffle, but usually it's equally rated. And then this is actually exactly the same task, but just with one setting changing. So here it's about whether they progress after they've got the trial right, or whether they can have multiple goes until they get it right. Now, the magic really comes when you combine these. So this is your classic randomized control trial design, where participants are going through the consent and demographics. Then they're hitting this affect test, stimuli set A, and then they're going to a randomizer, and they're either going to a control or treatment condition before finally doing a post-test, which is, again, the affect test, but with stimuli set B. And of course, these two, the pre and post-test, are counterbalanced. What we hear from people who are coming from Qualtrics is that it's just so much easier using the tree. It's just so clear. They're confident that what they have requested in the experiment tree design, because this is what the user interface looks like, has been correctly interpreted by Gorilla. The other thing we hear from people teaching research methods is that they hadn't been aware until they started using the experiment tree, the extent to which students were confused by the statistics, because they were actually confused about the experimental design. But now that the experimental design is much clearer, it's much easier to teach them the statistics. People create the most extraordinary experiment trees. I think the largest one we've had to date had 85 different nodes in it. You can create crossover designs, stratified designs, lotteries at the end for prizes. The possibilities really are endless. And this is a sort of overall case study of how we make researchers' lives better. Here's a story from before Gorilla. Jade had created an adaptive stop signal delay task, and it took her 2 months to build it in MATLAB. And then she set about recruitment and testing, which had taken her 6 weeks to collect data from 50 participants. So that took about 98 days. With switching to Gorilla, it had taken her 1 day to build the task and 1 day to test 50 participants online. She could have tested 500 participants online. So that's 3 months of time and salary saved, which can be spent on writing publications, dissemination, or just having a break. If that appeals to you, the next things you can do to get started is you can sign up to Gorilla. It's completely free to use all the tools and to test it on yourself, so just have a go. There's an in-app tutorial, say yes to that, and there's an onboarding webinar, which takes about an hour. If you watch the pre-recorded version, you can also go through it a bit faster. If you want to talk about your research in more detail with me and see what might be useful, then by all means book a demo with me. I always love chatting to researchers. It's the favorite bit of my day. Or if you just want to keep in touch, because sometime in the future this might be the right thing for you, then find me on your social media platform of choice, whether it's Blue Sky or LinkedIn or Twitter. I am around either as Evershed Joe or Gorilla Psych. And the thing to do to get started is take one of your lab studies where you know what the data quality is like, and then transfer that online, because then you'll convince yourself that the data quality is good enough. So in conclusion, what's our mission over here at Gorilla? We want our data quality to go up and our stress levels to go down. We want it to be easy to do the right things. We want to remove unnecessary burdens so that we can focus on the science that we love. And we want to focus on creating empowered behavioral scientists who can go out and change the world. That's it from me. I'll just put up that link from our 1 million participants paper there, and then those are my contact deals in case anybody wants to reach out.